What is catastrophic disclosure? That really depends on who you ask. To my knowledge, this term was first coined by former Colonel Karl Nell in November during the Seoul Foundation UAP Symposium. I'll go into some of his ideas on what constitutes a catastrophic disclosure, but before I do, I will say that any disclosure could be perceived as catastrophic, as it will cause us to collectively question everything we thought we knew about the cosmos. The downside to that is that such a scenario is unpredictable. The upside to that is that it unquestionably will wake us up, all 8 billion of us. It's not a wake up and smell the coffee, muchacho. It's more like wake up and digest the paradigm shift that only UFO disclosure can bring. On December 6th, Steve Bassett wrote, "It's going to take a worldview change at a global level for people and nations to wake up and start fixing things." Now, what could possibly trigger that level of change? He was, of course, referencing disclosure. The catastrophicness of disclosure, sure, isn't just about the non-human intelligences engaging our world and how they are engaging our world, but also the depth of the cover-up, which is the human, governmental, and corporate involvement in it all. Indeed, I think the depth of the cover-up will shake us to our core as much as learning about aliens in our midst. Here's a story that I didn't cover in the past, and I should probably focus on more exclusively in a future video. On June 19th, 2023, Jeremy Corbell broke a story about alleged cooperation among U.S. allies in striving to exploit non-human craft. Here's an excerpt from his website, Extraordinary Beliefs. On the heels of blockbuster testimony from UAP whistleblower David Grusch, a letter has surfaced which alleges the UFO cover-up is a multinational effort, and in Canada, a veteran member of parliament sent a confidential letter to that nation's defense minister. The elected official provides very specific details about an ongoing program within the Five Eyes Alliance, USA, Canada, Australia, UK, New Zealand, to analyze and reverse engineer exotic materials obtained from crashes of UFOs. Some of the materials in question date back to the early 1950s, according to MP Larry Maguire. Maguire urges the Canadian government to get out in front of the UAP story before further revelations destroy public trust and embarrass the governments of the Five Eye Nations. Or how about the recent story that broke in the Daily Mail by journalists Christopher Sharp, Matt Ford, and Josh Bosley, titled "Exclusive: CIA's Secret Office has conducted UFO retrieval missions on at least 9 crash sites around the world, whistleblowers reveal." Here's an excerpt. The source said the CIA has a system in place that can discern UFOs while they're still cloaked, and that if the non-human craft land, crash, or are brought down to Earth, special military units are sent to try to salvage the wreckage. Or how about this quote from the debrief article that broke the David Grusch story on June 5th, titled, "Intelligence Official Says U.S. has retrieved craft of non-human origin." Here's a quote from that article. "A vast array of our most sophisticated sensors, including space-based platforms, have been utilized by different agencies, typically in triplicate, to observe and accurately identify the out-of-this-world nature, performance, and design of these anomalous machines, which are then determined not to be of earthly origin," Gray said. Jonathan Gray, one of the UFO whistleblowers, backed up David Grusch's testimony and is a current employee for the National Air and Space Intelligence Center, NASIC. Now, the crazy thing about the alleged UFO cover-up that I believe is real is that it's a cover-up that consists of many countries, including the Five Eyes, of which we already covered. The sheer size and length of the cover-up, consisting of the greatest scientific discovery in humankind's history, once revealed, will shake humanity to its core. Not necessarily in a panicky way, but in a, this can't be real, no way. It's not possible. It's not rational. It's not logical. It's not doable. How could this be? It makes no sense. It's really a truth is stranger than fiction moment manifesting in our reality. But it's not just the size of the cover-up that is unbelievable, but also the length.
Or actually, it would be a greater analogy is you have a pen in your left hand and all of a sudden it shows up in Miami. I mean, you're talking about something that is accelerating well beyond anything that we know technologically can do.
And we have that documented, correct? We have that documented.
Absolutely, we do. And it's on radar. And we've had this actually. The scary thing is we've had this data since going back to the 1950s.
And then we have a quote by David Grusch from November when he was on the Joe Rogan Experience. And I quote, Rogan says, so this is 33. Year 1933 was the first documented UFO crash retrieval. Grusch responds, that is the earliest one I could talk about. Yeah, Rogan responds. There's something that predates that. Grusch responds, you can infer that. The 1933 crash that was referenced in that exchange is the alleged crash that happened in Magenta, Italy, but Grusch clearly implies there are UFO crashes that predate that. Just imagine for a moment that alien craft have been recovered for longer than 90 years, and all 8 billion of us are completely out of the loop of the most profound history of our world. If this revelation that may be coming, or something similar to that, doesn't wake us up, I don't know what will. A perspective that many people have emphasized is that catastrophic disclosure is more about the reputation of the establishment if an uncontrolled disclosure occurs versus chaos ensuing with your everyday citizen of the world. One thing I tried to underscore in the opening of this video that you just watched is that far more than learning there's a non-human intelligence in our midst engaging our civilization, it's how involved multiple governments and aerospace companies were for how long in implementing the cover-up, which is going to be the most difficult pill for civilization to swallow. And I come to this assessment that this is a plausible outcome is because nobody has expectations about non-human intelligence. We don't know how their psychology works. We're not familiar with their institutions. We don't hold their institutions to any kind of criteria. And presumably, they evolved in a different way than we did. So there's nothing pragmatic about making assumptions about how they operate and function. So learning that they're here, as startling as that may be, doesn't incorporate assumptions about who they are, how they engage with our planet, and what their objectives are. Those are deep mysteries, inherently. The problem with UFO disclosure is it's inevitably going to clash with our ideas about governments. Even if you're the most cynical person alive, I'm sorry, for your everyday person, this goes beyond even strong cynicism and distrust of our governments. I'm sorry, it just does. It's in the realm of, just think about it. The UFO cover-up incorporates potentially 90 years of lying to civilization about the second biggest question humanity ever has had. The first biggest question being, does consciousness survive death? The second biggest question of all time, are we alone? It confronts a reality, an alleged reality, that most people don't think is possible. No matter how cynical you are, that the US government and other governments could somehow insulate knowledge of a non-human intelligence or intelligences here for this amount of time. But it gets far worse, not just insulating the knowledge, but to the extent where they had alien artifacts going back to the 30s, if not earlier, as Grusch suggested. That is more of an ontological shock than learning we're not alone and we're being engaged by non-human intelligence. Because it goes so far beyond even really enthusiastic cynicism. Now there might be exceptions to that, but I'm not talking about people who've been involved in the UFO issue. I'm talking about everyday people who may have a mild interest in the topic, but are not invested in it like we are. And even we may find it hard to swallow if this all comes out in an official capacity, because believing something is true should not be conflated with learning it in real time in a manner that is indisputable in being conveyed by officialdom. Those are not the same thing. I'm sorry. I don't care how much you believe, oh, I'd be okay with it. It'd be like another Tuesday. No, not necessarily. Not necessarily. There's a big difference between having a perception in your mind versus living the unfolding of that perception. Living the unfolding of that perception requires much more digestion psychologically than just believing something. It just does. I'm sorry. And so my point is that the catastrophe that's going to emerge as a consequence of disclosure is primarily going to be a result of the sins of our governments and our aerospace industries that had this knowledge empirically and did not share it with the world. It is not, in my opinion, principally going to be because nature is weirder than we anticipated. Furthermore, there's something that makes this kind of revelation so different than anything else I can think of offhand. Because if the US government was concealing some freaky technology that they uncovered, and the reason they were concealing it was because it gave them such a huge advantage over adversaries, and they didn't want to take any risk with other governments getting a hold of this technology and therefore rendering our huge advantage gone. If something like that unfolded, we may not be crazy about it, but we could live with it. But the UFO cover-up is very different because it wasn't just concealing technology that could be utilized to have an asymmetrical advantage over adversaries. It was concealing facts about our universe that belonged to all of us. The technology, the progress made in understanding the technology, obviously that should be concealed. The problem is governments went thermonuclear in how they handled this curveball that they were given by discovering non-human intelligence, engaging our planet whenever that happened. They decided to go way beyond, we're going to protect any advancements or understandings that we have of this technology, but we're also going to implement disinformation campaigns so that all 8 billion of the humans that make up this world would be completely mistaken about the true nature of their reality. That's catastrophic. That's going to be hard to justify. And in fact, I don't think it's possible to justify. And if the American government, and more specifically, the elements of the American government that are actually read into this reality, tries to justify it, they're only going to dig a deeper hole. An apology is the only approach that is going to diminish anger by civilization and help foster mercy and forgiveness by those that were on the receiving end of these lies. See, the problem with covering up something this intrinsic about our reality is it inevitably removed so much free will from our grasp. I just don't think that you can mislead people on a question, on the answer to a question as fundamental as whether we're not alone or not, and not also simultaneously extensively strip them of their free will. Because part of having freedom to navigate the world is having information. Information is power. Power is freedom. You take away information, you take away freedom, you take away power. Consequently, you take away mankind's free will. Tyrannical at its core. I'll give you an example. North Korea. North Korea attempts to remove knowledge from its citizenry of how other countries operate and function. Why do they do that? Because they don't want their citizenry to start desiring a different way of life, to the extent that they would if they had greater clarity about how other countries function. And so I think it is completely valid for me to say that by covering up that we're not alone, it has been an expression of overwhelming tyranny and an attempt, whether wittingly or unwittingly, to remove the freedom of will from the human species. So in this light, when this finally comes out, it's going to be catastrophic no matter what. And Lou Elizondo is very famous for saying, this secrecy is not like fine wine. It doesn't get better with time. It gets worse. And so if I were to give the gatekeepers of this reality my advice, I would tell them that damage has already been done. But at this point, adding fuel to the fire is unusually irrational. Why would you do that? And if you would do it so willingly, then it's obviously not about humanity that you want to protect. It's about your own tail, isn't it? Yeah. So, and furthermore, the problem with covering up the answer to the second biggest question humanity has ever had is that it touches on everything. Religion, spirituality, philosophy, history, sociology, questions that we would suddenly have that we don't have because we have such a huge missing puzzle piece to reality. And even if you are to assert that someone like me or your average person wouldn't come up with huge insights about reality with the revelation we're not alone, that can't necessarily be applied to our greatest thinkers and our greatest institutions. And so if our greatest thinkers and our greatest institutions were given this information, maybe they would come up with amazing analysis and discoveries about our world that would ultimately become part of all 8 billion of us in our knowledge. So it's hard to overstate the damage that the cover-up has imparted upon all of us. So even the best case scenario and the smoothest disclosure will ultimately be catastrophic because we're all going to have to digest not only what has been covered up, but the damage that it inevitably did and the freedom that it took away from all of us. On November 22nd, Christopher Mellon's article titled "Disclosure and National Security: Should the U.S. Government Reveal What It Knows About UAP?" was published in the debrief.org. I'm going to cover some of it because many of Chris Mellon's concerns about disclosure, I think, echo former Colonel Karl Nell's concerns. And of course, I think it's Karl Nell who coined the term catastrophic disclosure. Chris Mellon wrote, "This is a pressing issue, as various committees and members of Congress are seeking to determine whether the U.S. government has incontrovertible proof of an extraterrestrial presence on Earth. Such a revelation would undoubtedly be the most shocking, profound, and transformative discovery in human history. Yet despite the gravity of the issue, Congress has been proceeding without holding any hearings or requesting any studies to assess the impact of this potential bombshell. It appears that our legislators are failing to heed the maxim, 'Don't ask the question if you aren't prepared for the answer.'" First and foremost, I want to say that this is a really excellent article penned by Chris Mellon, and he added a lot to the conversation through it. I have some minor differences, or maybe even more accurately, areas that I want to emphasize that he did not emphasize. So here he's emphasizing how the revelation of aliens would undoubtedly be the most shocking, profound, and transformative discovery in human history. But I want to underscore that this discovery would have to compete with the shocking earthly terrestrial discovery that potentially governments, and in particular the US government, has withheld this information from the world populace for 90 plus years. And it doesn't end there, but they engaged in disinformation campaigns, but very ironically, and I guess it could be shockingly, literally put taxpayer dollars into those efforts to mislead the global populace about the true nature of reality. So my point is, it's not just contending with the ontological shock of aliens in our midst. It's contending with the discovery that governments were more capable than we could ever imagine and more motivated than we could ever imagine to lead all 8 billion of us down the wrong trail on the nature of reality. I would argue that is as big, if not bigger, an ontological shock, and maybe even harder to believe than a scientific discovery encompassing non-human intelligence engaging our planet. Christopher Mellon wrote, "The first question that arises is, how can we make a fair determination about the potential risks and benefits of disclosure without access to all the facts? Suppose the US government recovered extraterrestrial technology decades ago. In that case, there has inevitably been some progress in assessing it and hopefully some insight gleaned regarding the nature and intent of its designers. However, no credible individuals purporting to have access to such information have provided any details. One of the only things we can say with certainty is that unless ETs prove to be angelic, which is not what our military is reporting, disclosure would undeniably frighten, if not terrify, large segments of the population." I don't know if I agree completely with that. Well, first of all, I do agree that they're not angelic. I don't know, but from what I've seen, I think there's a very compelling case to be made that abductions are occurring. And the metaphor we could use from our own world is, and this is a metaphor that J. Christopher King used when I interviewed him recently, is that it could be something akin to how we tag sea turtles, right? They could be monitoring monitoring us for whatever reason. It could be darker than that too, of course. But it wouldn't be something that is completely foreign to us, because it might just be a manifestation of us not being the alpha dogs. Just as the animal kingdom are not the alpha dogs on our planet because we do what we wish with them. And the aliens that are here do what they wish with us. And so it's kind of this ascending hierarchy, if you will. So my point as to why I don't know that, let me see exactly what he worded. It would undeniably frighten, if not terrify us, because they're not angels. I'm not sure I agree with that. And let me explain the logic behind that. The people that are having direct interactions with this phenomenon, they already know they're having direct interactions. They already know the nature of their interactions because they live it. The people that are not having interactions, their experiences are most likely not going to change after disclosure. In fact, their experiences are probably going to be more of the same. They were never directly interacting with the phenomenon prior to disclosure, and they won't directly interact with the phenomenon after disclosure. I think us as a civilization will quickly come to the rationale that, yes, there are people that are having unwanted experiences with this phenomenon, but they were prior to disclosure. And the people that weren't having those experiences prior to disclosure probably aren't going to have them after disclosure. So what exactly new is getting on the table if officialdom admits to this presence? Knowledge, but not experience. Knowledge, but not experience. Unless you want to argue that after disclosure, the behavior of the phenomenon will shift. And we'll cover that a little bit later. But my point is that I think it will only be frightening in the very near term, like the very immediate aftermath, if you will, and only for some people. But I think after a while, the psychology of people will acclimate quickly because it will be self-evident that whatever the phenomenon was doing prior to disclosure, it's going to do after disclosure. And if people were not directly impacted prior to disclosure, they won't be directly impacted after disclosure. Those people that were experiencing unwanted interactions with the phenomenon, well, guess what? They've already been experiencing that. So a government admitting and giving us evidence of this phenomenon is not going to change the equation for them. So are people really going to be frightened? I don't think so. And furthermore, people will also be fascinated by this new element of our reality. And so you have to balance out frightened with excited and inspired. And to some extent, I would argue the inspired and fascinated will cancel out the frightening because it's a situation with pros and cons, not just cons. It would be like, this is probably not the best metaphor or analogy. I always get those words mixed up. But it'd be like if someone gave me the opportunity to interview David Grusch, right? Maybe I'd be a little bit trepidatious because I don't want to mess it up. And I know a lot of eyeballs would be on the interview. But that emotion would have to contend with the opportunity. In that same vein, when disclosure happens, some people are going to be frightened, perhaps in the short term. But that's also going to be intermixed with people perceiving the opportunity. The very opportunities that governments have kept from the populace, which gets me back to our free will being taken away. Information is power, and it helps us navigate our world. It helps us to make informed decisions. It even helps us to determine how we want our attitudes to be. I think that disclosure would give a lot of people hope. Just as an example, it would give hope for parents for their children. Those that have children, they would have potentially the conversation in their mind, as well as media, roundtables. So this would be like a collective conversation that would emerge. It would be like, The world is in dire straits, environmentally and otherwise. But if we can come together and help unify our civilization with the objective to learn how these technologies work, we could improve the quality of life for everybody in the short and long term and maybe save our planet. So it's very complex. And there's different elements that will emerge and help to cancel out or to diminish other elements. So in the end, it might be far more balanced than we can perceive currently. Christopher Mellon wrote, moreover, what if disclosure precipitated a change in the behavior of an alien civilization, given that they no longer had an incentive to remain elusive and clandestine? What is the risk potential that disclosure might cause some governments to overreact, precipitating fearful and aggressive interactions? If these risks are substantial, does it still make sense to release such disruptive information? This is actually the best argument I've ever heard, and I'm well familiar with it even prior to this, of why the cover-up should continue. The problem with this argumentation, however, is that such a policy would not happen in a vacuum, number one. And number two, disclosure is inevitable whether the US government and other governments cooperate with being transparent or fight against the tide of inevitability. So it's like we have an option. Governments can either cooperate and willfully give in to the inevitable, or they can fight to the last breath and cause catastrophic and potentially irreversible damage to civilization. The choice is theirs. If disclosure is inevitable, why wait to the last moment? What exactly is that going to accomplish pragmatically? We're not going to create technology that can contend with these entities or creatures within the near future. I think if we were to interview the gatekeepers of the UFO secrets, they would absolutely agree with that. So let's do a risk-benefit analysis. That probably leads to the conclusion that the best risk-benefit assessment is to roll it out quickly so that the blowback and the distrust in government upon us all collectively learning we were lied to is minimized. Because it's inevitable, because our technology keeps getting better and better. So that whatever technologies the intelligence community has at their disposal that is revealing this phenomenon, the rest of the world that is outside of the intelligence community will pretty soon as well, right? So disclosure is inevitable. And indeed, ironically, it's by disclosing now that diminishes the odds of a catastrophic disclosure as the intelligence community perceives it versus disclosing 10, 15, 20 years from now, or at least intending to disclose 10, 15, 20 years from now. Because the longer these disinformation campaigns persist, and it's my opinion, I can't prove it, but I think there's strong evidence that we have been at the other end of disinformation campaigns. The longer this happens, the more motivated whistleblowers are going to become, and the more risk they're going to be willing to take to stop the nonsense and the unethicalness of lying to countrymen and lying to the world populace. And so if you increase the motivation of whistleblowers, I don't know, maybe they'll do something that maybe they shouldn't. Maybe someone within the government will release classified information that nobody would want to be released. But they've become so fed up, they're like, well, if this is the path that the intelligence community is going to take, I'll meet them halfway. We don't want that. But that is a plausible outcome. So the question is, does the government want to be perceived as part of the solution, or do they want to maximize the perception that they are the villains in this equation? I would suggest reading your Bible, praying to God. If you don't have a spiritual bent, thinking about it as pragmatically as you can and asking yourself, what's going to benefit society the most? I think if you do that from the most pragmatic and objective, with the most pragmatic and objective intentions possible, you're going to come to the conclusion that this secrecy is not like fine wine. It doesn't get better with time. Let's do it now. If the phenomenon changes its behavior, well, it was going to change its behavior anyways. But since it can be argued the odds of them changing their behavior are low, while the odds of waiting to disclose the outcome is being negative is high, from that risk assessment, let's disclose now. Right? It's like if you're playing blackjack and you get an 11, the odds are you should probably double down. Now's your chance. Don't wait. That's catastrophic. Chris Mellon wrote, admittedly, nothing as potentially ontologically shocking as UAP disclosure has probably ever occurred. Certainly not in modern times. However, there are still some interesting historical precedents we can examine. Consider the Sputnik issue that arose in 1957. Sputnik was merely a small satellite emitting tracking signals, not a weapons system. Yet the mere fact America was lagging behind the Soviet Union in space and missile technology immediately became a major political issue, reminiscent of the furor over the more recent Chinese spy balloon incident. It was not long before Congress and the White House responded and the space race got underway. Thankfully, what began as a military competition with the Soviet Union eventually turned into a collaborative space exploration effort involving the Russians and many other nations. So in that case, the initial fright and concern, which was a national security issue, ultimately led to major scientific and technological breakthroughs and laudable international cooperation. I would like to believe the UAP issue can follow that same path from national security to science. I'm going to read a big quote from David Grusch from his recent Joe Rogan Experience appearance. It covers a lot of ground that I think you should be well aware of or even review if you've already heard it, but it also will help me to segue into responding to that quote I just shared with you from Chris Mellon. Anyways, here's the Dave Grusch quote from the Joe Rogan Experience. Yeah, I can't get into it if we've made progress, if they've made progress, because that's like straight up some national security stuff. But like, I want that, just to be clear, I want the U.S. populace to learn a lot of this. And this is why, another reason why I went public is like, I need to call everybody out. I'm not here to admonish the entire government, mind you. But there is an element to the U.S. government and its cleared defense contractor base that, we have a 3-branch government oversight issue, like going back to Harry Reid. Harry Reid didn't even get access. I blanking talked to him myself to confirm that, and he said he was going to go talk to Biden because I think there needs to be a disclosure plan. This goes back to what's currently in legislation right now that's super blanking important because 90% of this should be open for public discovery, public analysis, and academia. This should be like at very least true nuclear programs such as nuclear physics you study at a university. Nuclear weapons, classified because that makes people in the pink mist. That's really sensitive. We don't need everybody to know how to do that. So I think the stuff that is like legit weapons related stuff, that's like straight up national superiority stuff. Sure, reasonably classify that. But these programs, we need a change. And that's why you saw the Schumer amendment, right? And I think you might have read that on air or something in a previous episode, if I remember correctly. Chuck Schumer, and I knew about the amendment a couple months before I went public. And that's kind of another reason why I did what I did. I'm like blank. I'm like the only guy that kind of has the opportunity to do this. I know what's in the chute, so to speak, that Chuck Schumer and his staff had with the Schumer Amendment, which is 67 pages of literal, we want to disclose. And I'm like, I have to spike the football by going public because, I can read the tea leaves on the Hill. And I think that they were hesitant to do anything without being able to point to something publicly. And I'm like, I'll be the blanking guy and just send it. And then, of course, a month after I went public, I guess I pushed Chuck Schumer over the ledge. And I do know he talked to the White House about the amendment, too. Because not like Chuck Schumer is going to propose groundbreaking legislation like that without talking to the National Security Advisor or President, like I imagine he did so. And, so you have this 67-page amendment, right? It's called the UAP Disclosure Act of 2023, known as the Schumer Amendment. Co-sponsors were Young, Gillibrand, Rubio, Rounds. Yeah, and Young. And, kudos to those senators for stepping up to the plate because they know this is real. I know what meetings they've had with certain other individuals that are, even more credible than myself. Allow me to quickly repeat a portion of the most recent Chris Mellon passage that I shared with you. And I quote, Mellon wrote, "Thankfully, what began as a military competition with the Soviet Union regarding the Sputnik scenario eventually turned into a collaborative space exploration effort involving the Russians and many other nations. So in that case, the initial fright and concern, which was a national security issue, ultimately led to major scientific and technological breakthroughs and laudable international cooperation. I would like to believe the UAP issue can follow that same path from national security to science." Now, I will share one little portion from the Dave Grusch quote I just shared with you. And I quote, Dave Grusch said, "Because 90-some-odd% of this should be open to public discovery, public analysis, and academia." He's referencing UAP in the historicity of it and the reality that it's here. It doesn't all have to fall under the umbrella of weaponization. So here's what I think regarding what I just went over for you. Disclosure would light a fire underneath all of our institutions. Our academics, our sociologists, our anthropologists, our scientists, our engineers, our innovators. It would be this collective fire that would bypass governments, transcend governments, to a point where that fire that would be lit underneath us all collectively would inevitably, in my opinion, ultimately seep into governmental structures, changing their policies, changing their perspectives. How could it not? Suddenly, all 8 billion of us learn that there is non-human intelligence engaging our planet far more advanced than us. Governments may be intransigent, but that intransigency is no match for all 8 billion of us having a fire lit underneath us. Eventually, our fire in learning this is going to seep into our governmental structures through who we vote for, through the pressure from people that are outside of the government to people that are inside the government. I think that's an inevitability. You can't explode this. You can't drop this knowledge bomb on all of humanity, and governments are not going to be influenced by how society changes as a result of learning this. How would that work? And so, unfortunately, the cover-up has been a control mechanism that has kept the trajectory of the human species going in one direction as opposed to the direction it would otherwise go in if they did not persist in the secrecy as long as they did. And to me, that's playing God, and that's a bad thing. And that just gets to the secrecy is not like fine wine perspective. It's not the outcome of coming clean gets worse the longer it gets delayed. Let's stop the nonsense. So on November 30th, I interviewed J. Christopher King, who was actually present at the Soul Foundation UAP Symposium. And I asked him about Karl Nell's discussion of catastrophic disclosure. Karl Nell was probably the most anticipated guest in that symposium. And so I'm going to share that clip because it's highly relevant. J. Christopher King also goes into the leaked slide from that presentation, which discusses the 10-year plan from 2024 to 2034 for a quote-unquote controlled disclosure versus a catastrophic disclosure.
But I do think, as some other people online have stated, and I'll be pointing more towards those folks, that when Karl Nell was talking about uncontrolled disclosure, he was speaking specifically if the disclosure came out from the phenomenon itself, from some of this non-human intelligence itself in an uncontrolled, chaotic way, or if this happened from the perspective of some of our some of the U.S. government's adversaries. You know, I don't think of anybody specifically in China or Russia as my personal adversary, but, you know, some of these world governments tend to think of each other as adversaries, right? And so he was referring specifically with this kind of like chaotic, catastrophic disclosure. He was talking about the reveals by the intelligence itself and by adversaries. So I think it's important to recognize that, because that's an important level to think at. Like, what if it did happen, as you're kind of hinting at earlier, from non-human intelligence itself? But then with regard to 2034, the 2034 thing, it was more about like, when is this all wrapped up and done? It wasn't like the first card would be played in 10 years. What I took from that presentation, and what I took in general from what people were presenting that day to observe Chatham House rules, that it was a process by which there would be like a full acclimation in terms of like the public conversation and things like that. And so, you know, there were little windows about like, when do we think that academia is fully going to be like, okay, you guys were right, fine, they're real, you know, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it was a little bit more about like kind of a strategy for a full society acceptance, rather than like just pushing the ball downfield. That was my understanding anyway. And I thought Karl Nell seemed like a very well-intentioned person.
I want to limit my commentary on that because we're going beyond 45 minutes already. But what I will say is, yes, from some perspectives, it would certainly be catastrophic if the phenomenon itself revealed itself prior to any governmental admission, and that the phenomenon's revealing itself in an unambiguous way would indeed elicit a catastrophic disclosure, because now the US government and other governments would be put in the worst possible situation, and they would come off looking the absolute worst. Furthermore, yes, from the perspective of the United States government, if a nation like China or Russia discloses first, those nations, or that nation that would do so, would have an enormous geopolitical advantage in terms of influence and being perceived as the leader of the world regarding how we move forward with this new revelation and dealing with it. I can't imagine the US would ever want to be put in a position that way. So from my perspective, in some real sense, the UFO gatekeepers and the aerospace companies that are also pressuring, delaying disclosure or delaying it as much as possible, are kind of throwing the United States interests under the bus, because the US government has an opportunity right now to nip it in the bud and to disclose ASAP. The longer that they don't go through with it in its entirety, the longer other scenarios can emerge that could harm the United States' interest in the geopolitical arena. But I fail to see how it's in the interest of the United States government to keep delaying this when all the negatives that can emerge will if the phenomenon or another government discloses first. To wrap this really long video up, I want to give two little excerpts from an article that dropped in the dailymail.com on November 21st titled, "Exclusive, Retired U.S. Army Colonel Says Secret UFO Projects Should Be Made Public by October 2030 to Beat America's Rivals and Get Ahead of a Catastrophic Leak." Here's one quote from that article by David Grusch, and I quote, "Let us advocate for transparency, not for ourselves," Grusch told the assembled attendees, "but for the generations to come as we embark on a journey toward a more enlightened and interconnected world." Yeah, it makes total sense. transparency is good for future generations, even if those gatekeepers that are holding tight to the secrecy may perceive that for them personally, delaying the secrecy now is in their best interest. And the other quote I wanted to share is, and I quote, "Perhaps most ambitiously, Colonel Nell expressed the hope of direct engagement with the non-human intelligences or perhaps extraterrestrial beings piloting UAP sometime in the next decade, a new interactive era of scientific discovery." Now, wouldn't that be something? What if it's true, and this is, of course, we can only speculate, but what if it's true that the NHI, the non-human intelligence or intelligences engaging our world, are waiting for a governmental admission before they initiate open contact? Now, governments might perceive that as, oh my God, let's delay that as long as possible because we don't know how that's going to unfold. But like, from my perspective, if they're waiting for an official admission or a proof emerging somehow, then obviously their initiation for open contact is inevitable, because those manifestations are inevitably going to happen for reasons we already went over. So if it's inevitable, let's have it happen now instead of in the future. I don't think these intelligences are all sunshine and rainbows, and there may be different factions, different species with different interests, and so it might be very complicated. But they're already here. Postponing disclosure doesn't make it so that they're somehow not already here. They're already here. So in a diplomatic expression, frankly, let's see what we can get from them. You know what I'm saying? Like, maybe they'll share some of their technologies that can enhance our quality of life. Medical technology, technologies that could improve the environment of our world and so forth. It might be a doorway into improving our civilization. Now, we could take an all or nothing approach and say, well, some of them are abducting our people and they're acting in a clandestine way. They can't be trusted. Like I said, let's say that's all true. That's still the status quo, though. So we can either continue the status quo without admitting they're here, or we can continue the status quo because we can't change the status quo. They're already here. There's nothing we can do to get them to remove themselves. So we can continue the status quo, but open up a door that could lead to extraordinary benefits for humankind. Now, this would be very complicated, navigating interactions with non-human intelligences when they're way smarter than us. I mean, like, we just got ChatGPT. Maybe they've had ChatGPT for 20,000 years. You can only imagine the tactics and maneuvers they could use, or they could engage with their technologies to, maybe try to win in bargainings, if you will. Well, I mean, they're already here, though. And if open contact is inevitable and it's going to be precipitated by disclosure, well, it's not like we're going to become so much more sophisticated in 10 or 20 years where we're going to be able to contend with them anyways. So I just say, from my subjective perspective, let's just blow this open and see where the chips land. And from a spiritual perspective, and I admit I am a spiritual person, I am an agnostic deist, meaning I believe there is a creator of the universe, but I do not subscribe to the idea that I can know which one of the religions of the world necessarily reflects the deity's perfect guidelines, if you will. That's just me. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there is a religion on this planet. But yes, open contact that's overt and not clandestine, or clandestine, however you pronounce that word, would be a scenario that we have never encountered. But as I was kind of getting at earlier, if there is a God and God created the heavens and the earth, then this is, I would argue, obviously a part of our evolution. Because if there are other intelligences here, God didn't just create us, this intelligence that we're familiar with, he created other intelligences. And he knew in his grand plan that inevitably the human species would begin to interact with these other intelligences. So whether it's good or bad, it seems to me it would be within the trajectory of the Almighty's will. So it's going to happen no matter what. I don't know. Pray for a good outcome. What can I say? We'll leave it at that. This was a very long video. I don't commonly do videos this long, but I think by now you've gotten the impression that I feel like the earlier we disclose, the less odds of a catastrophic disclosure, or at least minimizing whatever catastrophicness would be associated with disclosure. If we wait longer, I feel like we're maximizing that potential. Why would we want to maximize that potential? Now, please do not forget to subscribe. And if you'd like to support this channel, you can check out my merch shop where I sell t-shirts. You become a patron. You can become a YouTube member. You can give me a one-time donation. All those potentialities can be accessed in the description box below, or you can just slap a like on this bad boy, and I'll appreciate it so much. I'm on the shift schedule, if you will. I have been sleeping better, thank God, and I'm highly committed to using my energy in the most committed way that I can to put out as many videos as I can. So if you've ever wanted to support me in those kind of ways, now would probably be a good time. But if you just watch and share my videos, that's amazing to me as well. I'll see you in the next episode. Special thanks to all patrons, YouTube members, those that have bought merch, those that have given me one-time donation. I couldn't do without you. Thank you so much. See you in the next episode.